and it is sincerely my honor and privilege to introduce to you today Ken Gerhard.
Clip this little guy on here?
Yeah.
I guess we don't have to.
Here, you put that in your pocket and I'll clip you on.
Appreciate it. Thank you all for coming out. I appreciate it on a rainy day. It's nice to see so many friends in the audience too. Thank you, brother. There you go. Let me get on my mark here. I think that's where we're supposed to be. Alrighty. Well, again, thanks to Ken for having me out. Thanks to Epic for having me. Really excited to be here to talk about cryptozoology today. I know you guys cover a lot of different topics, ranging from UFOs to paranormal, all types of anomalous things. I'm assuming everyone's pretty familiar with cryptozoology. For whatever reason, all these different things tend to be lumped together. So I think those of us that are interested in one, we kind of share a common interest for all these different topics. But what I'm going to be talking about today is the book Monsters of Texas. It was co-authored between myself and my good friend Nick Redfern over here. Thanks to Nick for tagging along as always. The book actually came out last year, but it was actually probably about 7 or 8 years in the making, I think, because initially I think it all kind of started when Nick and I went out to investigate the Lake Worth monster back in 2003, 2004, somewhere around that area. And that was kind of the first time that we ventured out together to explore a Texas monster, a very notable Texas monster. And a few years later, Nick and I kind of got the idea that maybe we should team up, so to speak, and address a lot of the different reports of monsters and cryptids, and that's what we refer to unusual or mysterious creatures or animals throughout the world are known as cryptids. And of course, the field of cryptozoology actually goes back to the 1950s officially. And there was a Belgian zoologist named Bernard Heuvelmans that wrote a very famous book called On the Track of Unknown Animals. And that particular book sort of spawned a movement or a doctrine. Of course, at that time, there were many new animal discoveries being made. Most people are not aware of the fact, or many people are not aware of the fact that one of the things that really adds fuel to cryptozoology is the fact that there are continuing discoveries that are made in the field of zoology. Many of the discoveries that are made each year are new animal species, primarily smaller animals, of course, invertebrates and amphibians and fish and things like that. However, occasionally we do discover a very large, remarkable animal somewhere in the world. And as far as the field of cryptozoology goes, most people, of course, are aware of Bigfoot and the Loch Ness Monster and the Chupacabra. Those are sort of the notable cryptids that most people think of. However, cryptozoology is actually a very vast field, and it covers everything from sightings of big cats to things in the air, of course, mysterious sea creatures and so forth. So. Anyways, this is the cover of the book, Monsters of Texas. As you can see, we cover a wealth of different topics. We're very fortunate because Texas, of course, befitting of its great size, does have a number of mysterious animal legends and creature reports that date back literally centuries. Let's see if I can get this to work here. There we go. Now, many people do tend to, this was actually painted by a friend of mine. Many people do tend to romanticize what we do in the field of cryptozoology. Oftentimes people have referred to me as a monster hunter, which of course is very flattering. This is probably because I do tend to focus on a lot of the more fabulous creatures in the field of cryptozoology. And here you can see a little smattering of those. Of course, you've got the Jersey Devil and Mothman. There's a little Chupacabra hiding behind me there in the bottom. The Loch Ness Monster and similar lake monsters around the world, and of course thunderbirds flying over top there. It's understandable that these types of things, these types of reports really capture the public's imagination. And of course the media has made quite a big deal out of these types of reports and sightings too. So, and due to the monstrous nature of some of these creatures, obviously something like Bigfoot, like the Mothman, are considered to be quite fabulous and remarkable, and the media tends to embellish that quite a bit. However, there is real hard science in the field of cryptozoology. And essentially what we do, and here I am down in the nation of Belize, down in Central America, where they have had reports of Bigfoot types of creatures. Many of you may or may not be aware of the fact that Bigfoot is a global phenomenon. I mean, obviously you have the Yeti or abominable snowman of the Himalayas. China has a version known as the Gerhard. Australia has a Bigfoot type of being known as the Yowie, and so forth and so on. So it is a global phenomenon. Reports of Bigfoot type beings extend from North America down into Central and South America, where we have many different types. And in Belize we have two different types. One is called the Sisamite. The Sisamite is described as being very similar to what we know of as our North American Sasquatch. That is a very large or tall, hulking, hair-covered creature, obviously walking upright or bipedally like a human being. The natives essentially describe it very similar to the North American Sasquatch in that it is basically to be avoided, a very large, scary, smelly creature. In fact, the name Sisamite, the literal translation of that is shivers, because apparently to encounter a Sisamite causes one to shiver in fear and panic. There's also a second smaller type of hominid that's been reported down in Belize, and this is known as the duende. And the duende, which Ivan Sanderson and other researchers labeled as proto-pygmies, because they are essentially, standing 3 to 5 feet tall, but otherwise similar in description to Bigfoot. That is, a man-like creature, completely covered in hair, somewhat of a cross between human and ape-like characteristics. But anyways, the point being that what we do in the field of cryptozoology is that we actually go out and look for physical evidence of these creatures, because obviously we are following the scientific protocol, which is that you need hard physical and measurable evidence in order to convince the general populace and the scientific world that these things actually do exist. Now we're very fortunate in the Bigfoot field because we have some pretty decent physical evidence that most people aren't aware of. There are some really impressive castings of tracks, and I actually have one over here at my table around the corner if any of you want to check that out after the presentation. There are some alleged hair samples, some droppings and things like that that have been very ambiguous, that some scientists have taken a hard look at. So those are the types of things we're looking to gather and collect in the field of cryptozoology. Something, obviously, these are very remarkable claims, and to meet that measure, that standard, we actually have to come up with some pretty remarkable evidence. Obviously, the vast public thinks that Bigfoot and things like Bigfoot are, essentially publicity stunts and hoaxes and media events and so forth. People always ask me how I got into the field of cryptozoology. Well, it certainly wasn't something that I planned. Looking back, I have to say that I had a very fortunate and exciting childhood. My mother was a travel agent, and she was very adventurous, so we traveled all over the world, everywhere from South America and the Amazon jungle, which is where I'm pictured here, to the deserts of Australia, North Africa, and so forth. And wherever I went as a young boy, I was always fascinated with legendary creatures. That's what I was really into. I remember when I was in Australia that there was this creature called the bunyip, which was basically like a lake monster type of creature, and I was very interested in the bunyip. When my family traveled to Switzerland, there was something called the tatzelworm, which was like a strange reptilian creature that was said to lurk in the Alps mountains. So it's just been a lifelong passion of mine, and certainly nothing that I planned on as a career. But as I became older, probably about a decade ago, I became involved with some serious Bigfoot researchers here in Texas, and began going out into the field, and I actually experienced some things, heard some things. I've never seen anything. People always ask me, have you seen one of these things? No, I've never seen one, but I have heard some things that, to me at least, were quite unexplainable, and basically gripped my attention. So I wanted to pursue these things further. And this is my, as many of you will recognize, my cohort in crime over here, so to speak. This is Nick. Nick, of course, is very well known as He's a very well-known author in the anomalous field. He's written many excellent books about UFOs and also cryptozoology and some conspiracies and things. So Nick, like myself, is transplanted here to Texas years ago, but I guess we're Texans now, Nick, so we officially had the right to investigate and write about some of these different Texas creatures. Here Nick is holding, I believe, is that the one that Walt gave you?
Yeah,
Walt Andrus.
Walt Andrus.
This is an alleged chupacabra skull that Walt Andrus, one of the founders of MUFON, gave to Nick. I was actually kind of jealous after Nick got it because I kind of had my eye on it too. But
and it got mailed up in a box. Like
is that how I said it too?
Skull. And it arrived.
Anyways, the way we approached the book, because there were so many different things to cover, Nick and I kind of split up a little bit. He obviously was in a better position to investigate some of the reports. I at the time was living in San Antonio, so he was in the north, I was in the south. We did work together on a couple of the investigations, but for the most part the book is broken up into sections where we cover different topics. So first I'm going to talk about Bigfoot in Texas. Most people think of Bigfoot as sort of a Pacific Northwest phenomenon. We think of states like California, Oregon, Washington State. And truth be told, that is the part of the country where there is the highest concentration of reports or sightings. But as I mentioned earlier, Bigfoot is a global phenomenon. We have a lot of Bigfoot reports from the eastern United States and quite a large concentration throughout the southeastern United States, ranging from East Texas all the way over to Florida, where it's known as the skunk ape. And you'll find there are these different regional names or monikers that we use for different types of Bigfoot creatures, although the descriptions are always very similar to the Pacific Northwest Bigfoot. And again, that is a man-like creature, usually standing about 6.5 to 9 feet tall, very muscular with broad shoulders, no neck, long arms, and essentially very nasty and unpleasant, and something that you wouldn't want to encounter in the woods if you weren't looking for it specifically. It's interesting to note that the highest concentration of Bigfoot reports in Texas do occur in the eastern third of the state. And you can almost draw a line from I-45 on eastward. And for example, in the area around Caddo Lake, which some of my friends were out there camping this weekend, the piney thickets, the big thicket of southeastern Texas, the area in and around Beaumont and some of those areas. So we do have sightings around the state, in fact extending as far west as El Paso, which is actually quite surprising since you don't have a lot of forest or habitat out there that would support something like Bigfoot. But Texas does rank in the top 10 typically as far as the number of reports that are logged, and a number of good tracks and some other evidence has been found in the state as well. The history of Bigfoot-like creatures in Texas extends back to the 1830s, and that is a very famous legend known as the Wild Man and also the Wild Woman of the Navidad. Now this, it needs to be noted that the name Bigfoot obviously did not really appear in modern culture until the 1950s, the late 1950s, when these Bigfoot casts, or tracks rather, were being found in Northern California. And the name Bigfoot was actually created by a newspaper editor in Humboldt County, California. However, reports and descriptions of creatures like Bigfoot date back centuries, even going back into medieval Europe and beyond. And typically these creatures were classified as wild men because they were very man-like in nature. However, they were obviously had very bestial characteristics and were known to live in the woods, far and away from human habitations. There are accounts, many accounts in old newspaper archives of wild men that were discovered in the United States and also in the southeastern United States, not only in Texas, but states like Arkansas, Tennessee, and so forth. So you have this legend from the 1830s, and essentially what this is about is there's a little town called Sublime, Texas. Are all of you familiar with the Navidad River? It's kind of in the southeastern part of the state, sort of halfway between Houston and San Antonio, where I live. But essentially the story goes that there were these settlements down there near the town of Sublime, and people began to find human-like tracks on some of the riverbeds down on the Navidad River. And shortly thereafter, there were accounts of something that was breaking into people's barns and storage sheds and stealing food and provisions and so forth. Well, not long after that, the first encounters with the wild man and the wild woman, depending on who you ask, started to occur because they were often seen in groups or pairs. The descriptions were much like modern Bigfoot. They were essentially described as being wild people but completely covered in hair and walking upright on their hind legs. So you had this very famous legend in the 1830s. There was even an account where they actually, some riders on horseback even encountered one of these wild men and actually tried to lasso it and capture it. Ultimately, however, it escaped. So this particular legend is very famous in and around that area. And in recent years, some independent filmmakers that were going to, was it Texas A&M or University of Texas?
Yeah, well, I forget which one.
One of the colleges they were in film school, and a film student actually got the idea to make a film, a documentary slash kind of a slasher film remake about the events. And he was able to track down some of the original archival materials, and there were actually some journals from some of the people that were living in Sublime at the time about the encounters with the wild man. So this particular movie is kind of a take on that. I mean, it does use some of the original archival material. However, it's more of kind of a Texas Chainsaw Massacre type of movie with this monstrous Bigfoot creature. And in fact, one of their teachers at the university was a producer from the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre movie, so they got her involved as well. It's actually, Nick writes a very good chapter about the legend and the book, and the movie in our book. And I would encourage any of you to go out and check out the movie if you're interested in this type of thing. It's actually very well done, very entertaining. So the most famous Bigfoot type creature we know of in Texas is the Lake Worth monster, and I'm assuming that all of you, as sort of residents of the area, probably heard about the legend of the Lake Worth monster, also known as the Goat Man. And in fact, we were just talking about this downstairs a few minutes ago. I think Craig Woolheater's here, and he actually has several copies of the book, which is actually a very rare book and very hard to find. It was written by a woman named Sally Ann Clark, who lived in Fort Worth around the time, back in 1969, there were a number of reports that were making the newspapers. And we're actually also very fortunate to have Jim Mars here with us today, who was the original reporter who wrote those first articles for the Fort Worth Star-Telegram. And essentially, it all really started back in July of 1969 when two couples were parked out at the Lake Worth Nature Center, which is right on the edge of Lake Worth, just outside of Fort Worth. And they claimed that as they were parked out at this Lover's Lane area, that some monstrous beast jumped out of a tree onto the roof of their car and actually tried to abduct one of the women. And they were so panic-stricken that they drove immediately to the local police department and reported their encounter. The officers there were, pretty much impressed with the fear that was being displayed by these two young couples, so they did go out and investigate. The original description of the Lake Worth monster was that it was a scaly, hair-covered goat man. That's how they described it. Hence the name Lake Worth Goat Man, and probably the embellished photo there on the cover of Sally Ann's book. The following night, after the first article made the local newspaper, as you can imagine, hordes of people went down to the lake in order to hopefully get a look at the monster, because this was kind of like breaking news. And the following night, about 30 or 40 people were sort of traipsing around the nature center, and specifically an area called Greer Island, which is a little island that's right there by the nature center. And they claimed that they actually heard and then saw this monster. And the description at that point was a white, ape-like creature that was walking around on its hind legs. And it should be noted here as a sidebar that there have been reports of white Bigfoot type creatures. They're not as rare as you would think. Bigfoot comes in many different flavors and colors. So these people, this is where the story gets really interesting. Apparently, in front of this crowd of about 30 or 40 people, including some local police officers, the Lake Worth monster climbed up on this bluff and threw a spare tire at the crowd. So like something out of a King Kong movie, right? Causing all the people to disperse and get in their cars and drive off, including the police officers. So this made the newspapers the following night. Well, this is actually, if this actually happened, is a pretty notable event because I'm not aware of any other Bigfoot encounters where you have 30 or 40 eyewitnesses, and many of them were interviewed by the local newspaper and also by Sally Ann Clark. Now, Sally Ann was a local writer, and she was also an aspiring private investigator, and she was very interested in these stories about the Lake Worth monster. So she spent a good deal of time down by the lake over the following year, interviewing many of the eyewitnesses and gathering reports and evidence and so forth. And subsequently, she did decide to write this book. Now, admittedly, Sally Ann did inject a little bit of fiction into the book just to make it a little bit more interesting, which I understand she later regretted because she claims that she had 2 sightings of the monster herself subsequently, basically dashing across the road in front of her car as she was driving in and out of the nature center. On the right, we have the only alleged photograph of the Lake Worth monster, and it's kind of an amorphous white man-like blob standing in a field, but this photo was taken by a local business owner named Alan Plaster, who claimed that he saw the monster standing in some high grass and snapped the one photo of it. And I guess if some of you can kind of make out the head on top there's the arm kind of hanging down, and you can see a nose and facial feature. Now, this photo may very well be a hoax. There were allegations that there was a costume that was found in the trunk of a teenager's car, and that perhaps much of the Lake Worth monster may have been sort of a local teenage prank. In fact, when Nick and I first went out to the nature center, I interviewed some of the local park rangers who worked there, and they were pretty adamant that there was no such thing as the Lake Worth monster, that essentially it was a local legend that had been created by parents to keep their kids from going out to the lake and partying at night, which actually makes a lot of sense. So it could very well be that at some point someone did sort of jump on the bandwagon and decide to don this costume and scare people and so forth. But it's also interesting to note that when Nick and I went out to investigate for the very first time, we were hiking around the Greer Island area, and we actually found this weird teepee-like structure. And it was about this high with these different saplings that were kind of laid into a little teepee type thing. And nearby on the ground, there was a very flattened area where all the grass had been pressed down, almost as if something big and heavy had been sitting down there. Now, the significance of that is that these weird teepee structures have been linked to Bigfoot activity. In fact, myself and many other Bigfoot researchers who I correspond with, we tend to find a lot of these weird structures or formations in areas where there have been Bigfoot reports. And as far as I know, no one's actually seen Bigfoot constructing one of these teepees, but it's basically circumstantial evidence at this point. But it was pretty cool that we found something like that in an area where we certainly weren't expecting to find anything at all these years later. So that was kind of cool that we found something out there at all. The Lake Worth monster, sightings of the Lake Worth monster abruptly ended as far as we know after 1969. Although Sally Ann went on to collect reports for years and years afterwards, though she never wrote about it again. Unfortunately, she passed away. Do we need a battery? Unfortunately, Sally Ann passed away. Was it last year, Craig?
No.
Okay, yeah, it's kind of sad. She was getting up in years, but she definitely, this was a pretty big contribution to the lore of Texas monsters. And for people that are interested in cryptozoology, the Lake Worth monster is probably the most notable Texas monster. In fact, they still do an annual event out at the lake. They just did it a couple weeks ago, or I guess it was about a week and a half ago. It's called the Lake Worth Monster Bash. And it's more of a family-oriented event where they have games and rides, and they have a person dressed up like a goat man walking around. And it's kind of more of a fun event and not a serious paranormal conference or anything like that. But obviously the community is very proud of their monster, and it's become a big part of the local lore. Okay, so as I mentioned earlier, there have been reports of Bigfoot around the state of Texas. Now, I currently live in San Antonio, and one of the reasons I moved out there a few years ago is because there were a lot of things that interested me. And one was reports of Bigfoot in and around San Antonio. Now, back in the year 1976, which just so happens 1976 and 1977 were really big years in terms of the cryptozoology, because there just seemed to be a lot of reports of really weird creatures and monsters around the country. But in August of 1976, there was a spate of Bigfoot reports that took place in an area around Kelly Air Force Base, which is kind of on the southwest side of San Antonio. Kelly Air Force Base is now defunct. It's been purchased by, it's actually part of it's become Lackland Air Force Base and part of it's owned by Toyota. But in the 1976, there were a series of articles that appeared in the newspaper that revolved around a specific neighborhood near the Kelly Air Force Base. And it all began when a man named Ed Oliveri, a telephone worker, heard his dog barking one morning at 7 o'clock. He walked out in his backyard to see what his dog was acting up, why his dog was acting up, and he claims he saw a very large, hairy creature laying on the ground. Well, right about this time, there were some railroad tracks nearby, and a train horn sounded. And right when that happened, this hairy creature got up off the ground, and Ed was shocked to see it run off on its hind legs like a man. And he claims it was about 7 feet tall and completely covered in hair. He just saw it for a fleeting moment. But that did make the local newspapers. Actually, he kept quiet about it for a couple days, which is understandable. I'm sure you guys realize there's a heavy ridicule factor that's involved with these types of reports. But within a span of a few days, several of his neighbors began to report sightings of this creature too. In fact, his next door neighbor, Rose Medina, claims that she heard the dogs barking one night, and when she got up and looked out her window, she saw a small, what she described as a small ape-like creature sitting on her back porch. And she said it was about the size of a 9-year-old child, basically looked like a chimp. When she opened up one of her windows to shoo it away, it got up and ran away on its hind legs, much like the creature that Ed Oliveri saw. And Ed, who is by now very interested in this, in the events around his house, decided that there must be a mother and perhaps her offspring of a Bigfoot in the area. There were a few other reports in the area. There was a mysterious track that was found nearby and a manhole cover that had been lifted off of its resting place. And of course, this manhole cover was several hundred pounds and nobody knew how it got moved. Because it was 1976, for whatever reason, a number of UFO investigators began to show up to investigate these Bigfoot reports. And I always think that's interesting, but for some reason back in the 1970s, we had a lot of overlap between Bigfoot and UFOs, and Bigfoot was often linked with UFOs for whatever reason. So this is the location down here on the bottom, as it looks today, where the Bigfoot was first sighted. The people that live in the house now, which is right here on the left-hand side, they had no knowledge of the events, and actually the son was pretty jazzed to find out that Bigfoot had been reported in his backyard, and he did, from what I understand, he did like a show and tell at school about it. But as you can see, the area is still kind of overgrown. I mean, there's San Antonio, even though it's a major city, is actually kind of on the edge of a frontier area. And it's not uncommon driving around San Antonio to see deer and all kinds of animals running through Walmart parking lots and so forth. So, I mean, there is a lot of wilderness and habitat area. And even today, there are occasionally sightings of Bigfoot in and around San Antonio. Another famous Bigfoot report, or incident I should say, occurred down in the town of Vider, Texas. Vider is very, very close to the border of Louisiana, just east of Beaumont. And, oh, I'm sorry, we're in the Abilene one. I skipped ahead. Okay, backtrack. The Howley Hymn, this is a very famous Bigfoot incident. This occurred in July of 1977. No, we got it, go one ahead. I'm sorry, I skipped ahead. The Howley Hymn was reported in a town called Howley, which is just north of Abilene, Texas. And according to these three youths that were pictured here, these two young boys were out clearing brush on a ranch near Howley, Texas, and suddenly they claimed that they were besieged by this shower of rocks. Rocks just started flying at them from out of the woods, some of them quite large. And when they finally were able to get their bearings and recover from fright, they looked into the woods and they claimed they saw this, basically what they described as a 7-foot-tall ape man that apparently was, you know, what was throwing the rocks at them. They were obviously terrified. They immediately dropped their tools and ran to a neighbor's house. And they were able to convince this young lady named Renee McClure to come back with them, and of course they had a rifle at the time. That's the only way they were able to work up the courage to go back and investigate what had been throwing the rocks at them. And lo and behold, they claimed that the creature was still there lurking around in the brush. Well, apparently, in kind of a comical moment, the rifle was passed back and forth between the three of them as they tried to figure out who was going to take the shot. You know, nobody wanted to do to pull the trigger. They eventually did shoot at the creature, and it basically scrambled off into the brush, making a big hoopla and breaking branches and so forth. They did call out the local sheriff's deputy, and they did eventually find what they described as a human-like track, which is kind of, it's hard to see, but it's pictured over here on the right-hand side. The name Holly Him was actually kind of something that one of the youths uttered, and it was just kind of a comical name, and it stuck. So, and as it turns out, the young lady, Renee McClure, had claimed that she had also seen this creature on a prior occasion, but had been afraid to tell anybody about it until these two young men came forward with their account. So I'm not aware of really any subsequent reports of the Holly Him. I did travel up to the location about 3 years ago. The ranch is owned by a new landowner, and he was, you know, not aware of any of the incidents that had occurred there, and was really not that interested in talking to me about it. So, as you can imagine, when we go out and start knocking on people's doors and ask them about Bigfoot, sometimes you get the door slammed in your face, which is kind of what happened here. However, one lady that I spoke to at City Hall in Holly is still friends. In fact, she claims she's still best friends with Renee McClure, the young lady who had the sighting. And in her words, she told me that Renee doesn't like to talk about it anymore. So, you know, unfortunately, I did not have an opportunity to interview the young lady, which of course I wanted to do. Get it to go here. Thanks, brother. Okay, this is the one I was about to go into a second ago. This incident happened down in Vider, Texas. Vider, as I mentioned, is southeast Texas, very close to the big thicket area where we have a lot of reports of Bigfoot-type creatures. And incidentally, Nick writes a really good chapter about the big thicket in our book. Not only is the thicket known for reports of wild men or Bigfoot-type creatures, there's also some famous ghost lights known as the Saratoga or Bragg Road ghost lights, which I'm sure many of you have heard about. And in that specific stretch of road, which is actually a very creepy area, there are reports of Bigfoot, floating balls of light, and also big cats. So it's interesting in anomalous research that we sometimes have what we refer to as spooky spots or windows, very specific areas where we seem to have these high concentrations of various types of anomalous activity all occurring in the same place. Now you can draw your own inference from that. Obviously, you know, it's been theorized that these different types of phenomena are somehow linked. And you know, that's merely speculation, but it is worth noting that where we do have reports of Bigfoot, we often do find reports of other creatures, sometimes UFO reports, poltergeist activity, and the like. But this is a really kind of a crazy incident. A couple named Bobby and Becky Bussinger were living in a trailer home in Vider, Texas. And they called the sheriff's office one night to report that something was basically clawing at their windows and howling like some kind of wild creature. And when the police sheriff got out there, they told him that, you know, this had been going on for a number of nights, that they had encountered all types of strange things around their property. Something had actually killed some of their dogs. They found a weird teepee-like structure, and that word comes up again, on the edge of their property. Ultimately, when this thing began clawing at their windows on this one fateful night, Barney decided to go outside with a shotgun and, you know, fire off a round. And, you know, at that point, whatever it was that was creating all this ruckus disappeared into the woods. Well, understandably, Bobby and Becky decided to move out that night. They decided they'd had enough and they couldn't live on that property. Whatever was coming around on their property had basically driven them off. The sheriff parked out at the edge of the property later that night and claims that he